Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Politics Today, and in this programme we'll be talking about the top political story of the week, which is the resignation of the First Minister, known as Humza Yousaf, and we'll be asking what does this mean for the Scottish Nationalist Party and Scottish independence. And in this programme today I'm joined by Robert Harris from Voice for Justice UK, together with Alistair Scott from Vision for Israel UK. It's great to see you both on the programme, and I'll start off with you, Robert. Welcome back to Politics Today. And can you just give us an update on the really important work that you are doing with Voice for Justice UK, particularly the Commission of Inquiry into Discrimination against Christians, which is very important for our Christian freedoms in this country?
Yes, I'd be glad to tell you. Voice for Justice UK is doing work on a number of fronts, all at the same time. So we commissioned an inquiry that is investigating discrimination experienced by Christians within the UK. And we have a panel of commissioners who hears testimony, some of which will be online over Zoom, and that video testimony is uploaded to the website, people can view it, and members of the public are invited to be there, present virtually, to listen in. They can't participate. It's a bit like a court, you could say, where they can observe, but they're not allowed to speak. They need to respect the proceedings. And if somebody wants to retain anonymity, we have a procedure for that where they can give their story in private and we can anonymise their identity. We have a number of patrons from the public square who have supported us, which is very good. And the plan is to produce interim and a final report. The coverage is a 2-year period of hearing evidence, and we will, God willing, in due course, present that evidence to Parliament. And a connected issue, separate but connected, there's a report that we are about to publish about the experience that Christians have about faith, their faith, whether it's at work, online, or in other scenarios. And over 1,500 people submitted their experiences to the questionnaire, through the questionnaire, and all of that information has been thoroughly examined and investigated, and there's a comprehensive report which has the endorsement of a Member of Parliament. I won't say any more for now because the press release will be released very shortly and people will get to know more, but it's all very exciting.
Excellent, appreciate that, Robert. And it's good to see you back on the programme, Alistair, as well, with a glowing tan as well from Spain. Just give us an update on the very important work that Vision for Israel or Joseph Storehouse do, particularly at this very dangerous and critical time for Israel, with the nation at war against Hamas in Gaza, and the fate of the hostages are hanging in the balance.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head just by the question there, because it's such an important and challenging time for Israel and for works like ours, Vision for Israel and Joseph Storehouse here, is to get the truth out, because we were there at the beginning at October the 7th when everything happened and the whole world was so pro-Israel, but how quickly it's changed. And the media is reporting things as now the ogre is Israel and Gaza's the poor little victim. And we don't shun that what's happening in Gaza is awful to see the death. But personally, of course, as a ministry, we're still receiving funds and sending it over to Israel to help with the feeding programs. And, people forget the displacement of families in Israel. They're living in difficult situations without being able to do their jobs, so they need help. But more than anything, personally, in this nation, is the fight against the media reporting. I mean, Revelation TV is amazing. We report the truth. We have a balanced report coming through. But most newspapers, most agencies, most TV stations are not telling the truth. And the church, I mean, I'll tell you of an incident. We haven't got that much time, but just this week we had a phone call from a regular donor who was more or less speaking to one of our girls who answers the phone, blaming us for the war in Gaza. She was refusing to donate any more money, and it's all Vision for Israel's fault that there's a war going on. And there's this swapping over that's going on in the way people are thinking. And so we've got a real major fight to bring, just as you're talking about getting the voice. I love the voice
Absolutely.
of justice and Christian concern because they've got their fingers on the pulse. But we've got to be the same, reporting the truth and continuing to get into the church and reminding people in the church we need to be praying for the truth to be heard and for ears to be open to hear the truth. So it's a challenging time, it really is. Not financially, but challenging to get people's hearts, the battles for the hearts.
Absolutely. And what do you make of the what has been a very dramatic week in Scottish politics, Robert? The fact that we've seen the resignation of Humza Yousaf, Scotland's First Minister. Share with us your thoughts on these political developments and give context as to why Humza Yousaf had to resign.
Well, yes, it's been a huge challenge for all the parties involved in Scotland. There was an agreement for this coalition to work, Butte House Agreement, and it involved the Green Party in Scotland and the SNP, and there were certain things they had to agree on. And of course, the Green Party will have at the forefront an agenda to provide a green economy. There was an agreement that they would slash carbon emissions within a time frame, and it was a very ambitious target actually. But this was something that the First Minister and his party colleagues could not actually promise to implement. And of course, we don't know half the story of all the disputes that were going on behind the scenes, but they were unable to work together anymore. And of course, that led to his resignation. He's still in post, by the way, until they get a successor. But there's also, it's difficult to know what part this plays in it. The whole gender debate around gender self-ID, which of course is not on the horizon for now. And there's the CAS review in NHS England, where the recommendation is to exercise great caution within the health sector when children and young people come to you presenting with gender dysphoria, and whether any hormonal intervention should be used. And of course, the CAS review urges extreme caution. Those of the more progressive wing within Scottish politics don't like that. It's interesting because the CAS review doesn't apply to Scotland, but of course it does have influence and authority anyway. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of what was going on in the background there, but I'm sure we haven't heard the full story of what was being discussed privately between the two parties.
Absolutely. And Alistair, we were warned regarding Humza Yousaf becoming First Minister, that he was not capable of doing the job. We also see that Kate Forbes was the Christian candidate, a Bible-believing Christian, and she wasn't able to be given the job as the First Minister because they felt that a born-again, Bible-believing Christian should not lead a major political party or should not even be in government. So just share with us your thoughts about what this tells us about the Scottish Nationalist Party.
Well, it is a frightening scenario that somebody is just not considered because of her faith, and yet you've got another man who receives it, and his faith is in Islam. But from the very beginning, there was the stories that he was not really the man to do the job as a First Minister of Scotland. Kate Forbes sounds like the person who would be the ideal candidate. She's younger, she's got youth on her side, she's got fresh ideas. But yeah, it's a very important time. What does it say about the Scottish Nationalist Party? You know, I think there was there's the saying, and there's a book, power corrupts absolutely. And I think they got to that stage that they thought they were untouchable because they had almost a majority in the parliament. They were just one seat short. And therefore they were just trying to move things. And that he hasn't looked after the ones who are in opposition. And like anybody, look after the ones below you when you're going up the ladder, because otherwise they're going to stab you on your way down. And I guess he's paid the high price. Let's be honest, the SNP was under scrutiny anyway because of the previous leadership and the financial shenanigans that were going on there. And that's still in...
Nicola Sturgeon, her husband, and then burying the campaign funds that given for the campaign and was found in the garden.
And that's an ongoing dispute that's there. So he's taken on a difficult situation, but I think they were overconfident that they still have the SNP, they still have this separatist theme going on in Scotland, and I think it's caught them out. And of course now he's on his way down. It's difficult for anyone who takes over from him to put things right, and the elections are coming up soon, and it makes you wonder how they're going to do in the next elections. They had a massive swing in a decade from Labour-run Parliament to SNP, and it looks likely that it's going to turn around again.
Robert, engage with us your thoughts on the Scottish Nationalists' obsession with woke legislation at the expense of governing for the majority of Scots. Obviously, we're not Scottish in this programme, but it's such an important issue because I think Scotland is a kind of role model to discuss about how we should not do politics, how we should actually prevent these woke political ideologies becoming legislation and the impact. So we saw that Humza Yousaf oversaw gender reform policies as well as hate crime legislation that has essentially caused his political downfall. So what impact will this now have for their vision for Scottish independence, do you think?
Difficult to say, because the Scottish independence thing separately, it has its own sort of narrative and its own climate, and I don't see that going anywhere in the foreseeable future. The gender self-ID thing, let's just put a bit of context to this. The Scottish Parliament, unlike the House of Commons, is not a supreme parliament. So unusually, and I think it was the only one time when Westminster, Rishi Sunak, used a very unusually worded piece of legislation in the Scotland Act where they can override the Scottish Parliament when they've passed something. So this bill got the assent, I think it got the royal assent, etc. It went through all the hurdles, but they vetoed it. House of Commons is supreme. Scotland Act gave authority to the Scottish Parliament to govern within a certain remit, but in very rare circumstances, the UK Parliament, the British government can actually override Scotland. So they did that. So they couldn't do anything about that. It went through the courts, but the courts ultimately deferred to the Westminster Parliament, Westminster government. So that's one thing. The hate crime bill, I thought you'd bring this up, and I've got just an extract of the text in front of me, because otherwise we're just talking vaguely about what the hate crime bill is. First of all, throughout Western Europe, we are seeing multiple attempts, many of them successful, in hate crime legislation being pushed through Parliament to what they claim to protect minority groups. And of course, we're all against violence. You can't call yourself a Christian if you condone violence, period. No one should be abused through words, but there is this difficult thing where my freedom of speech might offend somebody else. And that's where this debate becomes, it creates a huge climate of divided opinion. So in this legislation, a person is deemed to commit an offence if they communicate material, which potentially would be online or in some other way, or behave in a manner that, and I quote, a reasonable person would consider to be threatening or abusive. And the intention has to be, and this is my words, the intention has to be stirring up hatred based on things like age, disability, sexual orientation, transgender identity, and variations in sex characteristics. Now the question is, what is reasonable? Now the concept of reasonableness is a key part of our English legal system and in Scotland too. But what might be reasonable to you, I might find unreasonable. And ultimately these questions will be decided by a judge. The question is, if freedom of speech is to mean anything, should people be afraid to think, oh, have I said something that might offend somebody when I'm only expressing a legitimate view held by millions of people? I might get, in trouble. And unfortunately, we're seeing in England, Wales, and large parts of Western Europe, these cases are coming before the courts. It's well known, of course, preachers in the street, quoting the Bible, in almost all the cases I'm aware of, they haven't said anything remotely offensive. Somebody there will be offended, they claim they're offended. The police are not lawyers, and this is the thing. They're not lawyers. In the moment when something is happening, they have to make a quick decision. And sometimes, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, they might be thinking something serious has happened here, and they will sometimes arrest the person who is accused. But no, we shouldn't be in that situation. If freedom of speech means anything, these traditional freedoms that have been there for centuries should not be limited and restricted by the state. And there is this argument that says the law that we have, and that applies to Scotland, not just in England and Wales, already adequately deals with these situations. To bring in these additional laws is unnecessary. And one might argue it's just a nod to the progressive wing of the parties, but we don't need it. There is a defence, and I just want to make one other point. There is a defence that they say, if you've got your free speech, you don't have to worry about it. And the defence is that if you have to show that your words or your conduct were reasonable. But why should the onus be on the person who is the accused?
Exactly.
That is all wrong. It's all wrong, and it's giving the alleged victim more power within the legal infrastructure. And we know this is happening too in Canada, and that's a whole different subject. So I think a lot of us are very concerned about this, and there are many people who don't claim to be of any religion. They might be old-fashioned conservatives, old-fashioned liberals, and they are very concerned that this is an attack on freedom of speech. So we all need to be concerned about this.
No, absolutely. Thank you for raising that, Robert. And Alistair, share with us the dangers of Western governments, and particularly looking at the government of Justin Trudeau in Canada, in bringing these woke, progressive, authoritarian policies that the SNP have adopted. We saw that Nicola Sturgeon, when she was First Minister during COVID, she overextended her power and her influence, using that crisis to amass unprecedented power for herself. And share with us how Humza Yousaf has actually followed in that progressive, authoritarian nature that they are opposing upon the Scottish people, and knowing that the Scottish people are a very proud, independent people, to bring in this kind of authoritarian legislation isn't going down with the Scottish people, nor will it go down with the Scottish electorate, will it?
Absolutely. And it's like a test case, and you mentioned Canada. It shocks me when I think back how things have changed in such a short time. And it's because there is a global movement going on to try and bring in this wokeism, to try and bring this liberal thinking. And what we've seen happen in Scotland, and we need to be praying about it as Christians, is they overstep their mark, and suddenly people come back into a reality check and say, it's like, we've just been hearing, there's been a change in the foundation of the law, really, where it was you were innocent until proved guilty. From what you were just telling us, you are guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. So the onus has totally changed, and this is the globalist kind of plan to control what you say, and as long as you flow with what they want to be flowed, you swim in the right stream in the right direction, you're free to do whatever you like. But as soon as you're not even challenging, you're just, it's a bit like, when we go out in the streets and talk about Christianity, I'm not saying you have to follow me, but I'm just giving you an alternative style you can choose. It's your choice. I'm not going to hit you over the head if you don't choose it.
But that's just it though, isn't it?
Exactly.
They don't want to give us choice. And that's the problem as well, because we know that, for example, if the SNP started to govern in the interests of the Scottish people, put job creation first, education first, improve the economy in Scotland, then they would still have that majority of support, which would push them independence. But now people have realised and woken up that actually they're supporting woke policies that actually endanger freedom, endanger democracy, and they are being like the guinea pigs, experimenting on these political ideas that are at best fringe, at worst authoritarian, and dangerous. So Robert, share with us along those lines how the Scottish Nationalists have not served the interests of the Scottish people. And it's like everything in politics, isn't it? That when you're on that political ascendancy, you have that momentum, you have that support. But once you've been in power for a certain period of time, and when things start going wrong, you're the ones to blame and are responsible. So share with us how effectively we've seen that the SNP have really brought this crisis amongst themselves by pursuing these extreme woke ideas and also these dangerous green zealot policies pushed out by the Green Party that do nothing to effectively protect the environment, but effectively to destroy our economies, to ensure that the price of food increases, so we have food shortages, and then actually put our own civilization in peril.
I think there's a history here. The SNP, in my view, has what I would call an authoritarian streak. You mentioned authoritarianism. Yeah. I think there's a strong authoritarian streak. A few years ago, there was a law pushed by the SNP which went through all the hurdles of the Scottish Parliament. It got the royal assent from the Queen. It was popularly known as the Named Person Scheme. What that meant in a nutshell was that the state would assign to each child, regardless of whether they're a problem child or from the healthiest of families, they would assign a state official, which typically could be a health worker or a teacher, to that child to oversee, to monitor their well-being according to some published data. And they would argue, the advocates would argue, only in very exceptional circumstances would they intervene. Intervention would look something like this. They could interview the child without the parents being present about what goes on in the home. They could gather information about the child and his or her family. You could call it intelligence gathering, for want of a better phrase. Now, this caused a huge uproar among different groups, Christian and secular groups, who felt, rightly so, that parents, their authority, was being usurped by the state. And we're seeing this in many jurisdictions across the Western world and beyond. And thankfully, this case went through the courts. It eventually ended up in the Supreme Court in Westminster in London. And they found that part of this legislation breached human rights. So ultimately, this is authoritarianism in the extreme, this particular example. And it's very rare because, as I say, the Queen gave it her signature. There was the feeling that this was the end of the game. They got it through. Yet the courts exercise their function in scrutinising Scottish legislation. I said a few moments ago that the Scottish Parliament is not supreme. It's the Westminster Parliament that's supreme, and in very rare circumstances, the government can override Scottish legislation. But in this case, it was the court that scrutinised a Scottish piece of legislation, and they found it to be incompatible with human rights. So this is a very serious thing, but they keep trying. The progressives do not give up. No. And neither should we, by the way.
No, absolutely. But I mean, it just brings memories of looking back at the history, looking at the Stasi, the secret police, or the Hitler's Nazi youth. I mean, where you have complete state control over the child is dangerous, and where you take away those parental responsibilities from the parent and give it into the hands of the state, always dangerous. We're down to the last 5 minutes of the programme, so I have far more questions and stuff to go, but I don't think I'll be able to get through them. Alistair, on kind of reflection, when we also look at the coalition of the SNP with the Green Party, they very much pursued the zero carbon net emissions to the extent that that was too much for the SNP to actually follow the demands laid by the Green Party in their coalition agreement with the SNP. Just share with us how this is really a kind of wake-up call to us here across the UK to realise the dangers of pursuing such policies, woke policies, these zealot green ideas that are actually not designed to protect the environment, even though they claim they are. But the reality is they are designed to empower the globalists. They're designed also to take away our freedom and increase the power of the state. Isn't it dangerous that what are the dangers regarding this, and how should we be alert concerning it?
So very dangerous, because there's a tendency in political parties to do this. The SNP had a history of promising things that they didn't show how they were going to financially prepare for it. How was it going to be costed? And I think that's what's caught up with them, with the whole working along with the Green Party and all the things that they want to do in a hurry by 2030. You're talking 6 years down the line. They wanted to be absolutely green, and they had never put down any costs. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to make it happen? And at the end of the day, they're saying things like, are going to affect the pocket of the everyday man in Scotland, and how they're going to replace their gas boilers at huge cost to have this green, perfect society. There's a lot of perfect ideals we would love to see happen, but the cost of it, who's going to pay for it? How are they going to pay for it?
We're already facing that. I mean, look at the cost of food. The increase of cost of food has gone through the roof. The cost of fuel is going up, and that's all having a huge impact.
There's more and more food banks around. There are people who 5 years ago are having to go to food banks just to put food on the table for their kids. So, I think the SNP's history was not good, but they had hoodwinked people to believe they were going to be nationalists, they were going to be independent, and I guess they were thinking they were going to be supported from the EU if they separated from Britain and joined in with the EU. But I think they've overstepped their mark, and everything's been shown.
The other question I have to bring in, I mean, what are Kate Forbes' chances now of becoming the new First Minister, and can she resurrect the dream of independence for Scotland under her leadership? And we've already seen that when she was Minister of the Treasury, she's more than capable of pulling off political manoeuvres, such as having a whole day to actually bring about the budget for the Scottish Parliament.
I think personally, I feel that she has demonstrated that she would be a very competent leader. Sadly, I think the reality is they won't allow her to actually be a leader. There is so much intolerance towards Christians. And of course, let's just remember very briefly that she never rushed to people and said, "This is what I believe, will you listen to me?" No, never. The interviewer asked her, and she bravely and rightly responded. And she was,
spoke the truth.
She was treated appallingly by the media. So I don't think they're going to allow it to happen. Unfortunately, the democracy that we live in doesn't allow certain people to rise to the top because they have the wrong views as far as they're concerned.
And Alistair, how should we be praying about this situation in Scotland, particularly for our Scottish viewers? I mean, you can also see with the resignation of Humza Yousaf that there was so much prayer involved in this one. Exactly. You see the hand of God moving in power, as we know that ungodly legislation produces tyranny. And where we see godly legislation emerge, then this effectively creates a climate of righteousness. How should we be praying? 30 seconds.
I really believe there is a massive movement of prayer going across the UK, the United Kingdom, right from Ireland across to England, Wales and Scotland. And I think that's really brought this about. But we need to continue to pray. And as Robert said earlier, we continue to fight. We fight in the spirit. We're not fighting flesh. But pray, your kingdom come, your will be done. That's Amen. My heart.
Alistair and Robert, thank you so much for being my guests on this week's edition of Politics Today. Thank you for watching this programme at home. Let's continue to pray for Scotland. Let's continue to pray for the political situation there, that God's will be done. And thank you for watching this week's edition of Politics Today.